morning, and good morning to you. Thank you three for being here with us. I feel like the lucky one today with this panel. Let's jump right in. Raj talked earlier about how the mobile phone was the big unlock for Uber and thousands of companies that rose during the mobile phone era. For companies that want to use Gen AI to unlock value in business, Elizabeth, start us off by talking a bit about what is possible today that wasn't possible just a few years ago.
Well, first of all, I feel like the speakers so far have been awesome because a lot of this topic to me is easy to be so abstract and not very concrete, and I think we've already begun to demystify that into a lot of practical examples. And two things that have been said so far that really stood out to me are this reset moment we're in because of accessibility in a way that it was not the case 10 years ago or even a year ago. And then the second that Raj ended with was this notion of bringing out the best of humanity. And I'll talk about both of those in the context of Stitch Fix because I think it is a very good concrete example. And so just going back to first principles on this whole topic, really the question is, what is the job to be done? In this class that I teach at the GSB, I actually bring in speakers, including the Stitch Fix team, and a lot of the belief there in machine learning is you need a clear objective function. What is it we're trying to solve for and optimize? You need robust amounts of data, and then you need that constant feedback loop of testing and learning and measuring the metrics of, is this actually working? And so with Stitch Fix, I would say, as Raj was talking about his book and this shift from search to seeking, like that really was the idea behind Stitch Fix. This idea that, you know, fashion is such a complex choice, it's such a pain to shop. Most of the time you're trying on so many things that you don't actually love, and it's very, very hard to find them. And so the original idea was, how do we ship things sight unseen and help you find the things you love with some information? But the really hard problem in the very beginning of that business was having enough data. And so over time, the objective function with the original model that existed when I joined the company was the fix. You get a box. You keep hopefully as many of the 5 items as possible. The objective function was all around the keep rate of that box that got shipped to you. After I joined, we launched another product called Freestyle, which allowed people to shop on demand. And that objective function was, of course, conversion, engagement, and what we found with that was a lot of upside in people being able to interact real time versus that original fix. But the building of the data was one of the hardest parts of that, and transaction data is by far the highest quality signal. But a big question that the team had had is, how do we generate even more data? And so a widget was added to the app called Style Shuffle. If any of you are Stitch Fix customers, you might have seen it. Or if you've ever been on Tinder, it's kind of the same idea of a thumbs up, thumbs down. But that actually multiplied the data dramatically. And so what I think is interesting back to these two things that have stood out to me on access and humanity is generating that data, like as well as generating the algorithms to infer what does that data mean and what should we ship to a customer. You know, seeing that clarity example, like that is all now possible for so many young brands or legacy brands in a way that if you were to build, say, Stitch Fix today, rather than having to take multiple years to accumulate the data to know how is that keep rate improving, which signals matter most, you could actually be leveraging a lot of third-party data or a lot of the large language models to be able to make that happen. And then lastly, on the humanity front, one of the things that we were working on when I left, and actually it was disappointing to me, we had done a pilot during COVID with allowing our stylists to chat live with customers. And a lot of the features of that experience had been like, how do we do this as inexpensively as possible to scale styling, which was actually not all that high touch. You know, a lot of the algorithm was doing as much work as possible, and then it was like 7 minutes last mile, the stylist finishing the box to make sure it actually made sense. But in reality, like many of us like want to talk to somebody. We want to see the clothing. We actually want to have a little bit of engagement. Maybe it's like a real-time issue that just popped up today. And so we started testing live styling, and what was extraordinary about it and got me super excited was that people's happiness scores went up, their likelihood to return went up, and actually their what they would spend went up by 20%. The problem was it was super expensive because the stylists would have to do work ahead of time. We didn't have the features and tools to do it on demand. But if I could do that today with now what's happening with Gen AI, like that is bringing the humanity into the experience. And I think that's what's really exciting is, remove all of the work and maybe even parts of that to like the way that wine.com example was being shown. Could start with chat, which is probably not being done by a human, but then if needed, a human could intervene and be available on demand. And that, at the end of the day, is like the highest and best use of that human interaction that can't fully be solved, but that first 80% of the experience could be done by Gen AI.
Wonderful. Fiona, maybe you could build on some of the exciting impacts you're seeing at Wayfair as Gen AI has become so much more prevalent.
Yeah, for sure. And so we have a very similar experience, with Stitch Fix, obviously also a very style-based, emotive category. Furniture is very similar, right? And I think one of the interesting things actually, Raj, you brought up, like you actually had a whole paragraph of how you're describing what you're trying to buy. For a lot of our customers, it's really hard to describe, right? What style it is or what it is you want. So how do you incorporate some of certainly the conversational aspects, but some of the also kind of visual aspects, right? And so generative AI can help in both of those cases. I think a lot of times we talk about ChatGPT and it's mostly the text generation. But one of the things that, for example, we're looking at is also looking at the image generation and how do you kind of say, okay, if you, for example, Raj could have taken a picture of his room, which is something that we've been trialing. You take a picture of your room and you say, hey, I want to imagine it in 17 different styles. And the generative capabilities now shows you your room with different kinds of settings and furniture based on 17 different styles that you can then shop. So it gives you another way of shopping, and I think that's the part, in commerce in general, and e-commerce especially too, right? I think human behavior and what are the right ways that you can sort of augment/pivot them away from how they're normally used to searching, and then what are the right ways of doing it, right? Because for us, I think in our category, just straight conversational may or may not be the only way that you would augment search. So how do you incorporate potentially visual as well? But I think a lot of the topics we've actually all talked about, it absolutely resonates. I mean, a lot of it's around what are the processes that we are already doing today that we can do better. So customer service agents is a good one. We really believe very strongly. For those of you who've shopped Wayfair, I tend to have customers tell us, oh, we love the customer service part of it, which is interesting part. I mean, ideally, it's a category where the chance of getting something slightly wrong high, right? You think about it's very hard to ship. There's damaged style. Sometimes you want to talk to somebody. So we never want to. It's a core tenet. We never want to lose the human in the loop, the customer service person, the ability to have that connection. But you want to make that person as superpower. I think somebody said, make them, kind of make them much more productive. And so that's where we're using. That's I think a very easy use case almost for generative AI in order to power that. So those are some examples. And then I mentioned some of the experience examples, with more of the visual capabilities. We're doing that in a way that's more controlled. So I can share the link to the site that we have. But basically, we want to make sure that it's not, because there's still hallucinations, right? So we want to make sure that if we're exposing something directly to the customer right now, where the tech is still, it's almost there, but not quite there, they can still control that. And they're looking at the pictures of their room, and they can say, okay, well, maybe if the generated couch, the leg looks a little wonky, it's okay, I still get the idea. So with those more experienced things, we're kind of doing that sort of on the side of the main experience and trying to learn as much as possible and then feeding it back into the main site.
It's interesting. I think one of the things we learned at Walmart was computer-aided associates were really powerful. It created the human connection and really allowed the associate to be more effective with the customer. And so this is an area where I think Gen AI can make a big difference. And it also helps cover for some of the problems we're seeing, which is inaccurate data, hallucinations, et cetera. So having the person there and ideally instrumenting what they're saying so you can improve your data and improve the quality of response later. So, I'm seeing a bunch of applications across go-to-market, marketing, customer service, et cetera, where the Gen AI can really help people be way more productive and get smarter as it goes. So.
Great examples and great concrete examples for this group. Let's change gears to skills that are required going forward. We've recently been reading a lot about salaries increasing exponentially for those with skill sets in AI. Fiona, why don't you tell us what you're seeing in terms of skills that are required, both technical and non-technical, in this next chapter moving forward?
Yeah, so I think, Wayfair, we've been in so I would say it's more on the machine learning space, kind of similar to Stitch Fix, for probably a decade or so. So we have, the data scientists and the software engineers and et cetera. I think that skill set still is necessary. I don't know if it's changed that much since then. I think the way we operate is potentially a little different, right? We talked about, I think it was Raj who talked about coach. So there is that, because I think now that there is maybe more ability to take advantage of some of the generative capabilities. For example, the code reviewing capability is absolutely very, very critical. So that's more of a honing in on some of those skill sets. I do think there's a lot that is around it besides the technical skill sets, right? I think, for example, we have a group that looks over sort of all the use cases where you want to use generative AI, and so your finance person and your legal person to kind of look over, make sure that we don't go overboard and end up spending a lot of money on a use case where the ROI isn't quite there, and also legally, like what are the terms? We want to make sure that from a reputational risk and just enterprise risk perspective that we're covered, right? So I think those folks have had to come up to speed really quickly on all of generative AI. And then I think the other part is also the business folks, right? And trying to make sure that they're also well read up in terms of like ideating and thinking about not just necessarily incrementally improving processes, but potentially just, hey, look, how might you just completely do it differently? And so having, I think our business folks as well, our commercial teams, also read up on it and sort of being part of the process in terms of ideation, I think getting them to think a little bit differently because of the tools that are now available, I think is important as well.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think, skills in data engineering, integration is important. Basically, all of these are going to require your teams to be able to integrate with large language models and other services. So these are things that people are familiar with. I think it's retargeting some of the skills, but then adding a whole other layer of prompt engineering and sort of figuring out how to get the LLMs and other models to do what you want them to do, and creating data and process around that. That skill set, it's sort of an evolution of what we've been doing with process engineering over time. So.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about those comments about creator and coach, I actually think a lot of this is having like that product management mindset and really bringing together cross-functional teams. Many of these use cases are either going to be like productivity, make it like way easier, way simpler to do things, like some of the content examples that were shared. Being able, I work with one healthcare company, and in that space, there's a lot that relies on reimbursements from the payers, and it's a lot of work to get that done. I know this is a pretty heavily retail environment, but maybe folks have also worked in healthcare, and that's one of the biggest sticking points is just getting stuff done with that in that environment. And in that particular company, their chief medical officer has started using ChatGPT for like the more cumbersome notes to payers to get reimbursements that oftentimes would take 2 to 3 hours. Now, the first version maybe has some falsehoods in it, back to the hallucinations, but what would have been a 2 to 3 hour exercise might be 5 to 15 minutes, which is a massive difference. And so I think having kind of product-oriented teams, whether it's customer-facing experience or productivity, and really like unleashing teams to have access to this is, I think, very, very exciting. And I think in my experience, maybe more drawing back from my days back at Bain, like being able to be energized around unleashing change, that can be a very, very powerful tool within teams. And so often just having like those tiger teams and that PM mindset on any team, it's such a technical topic. However, the real value lies in the use case and the harnessing of cross-functional teams.
Thank you. Let's move on to sort of where we are in this point in time. This feels much like 1997 when the internet was the disruptive technology. That seems like a million years ago when you look at where we are today. We launched Walmart.com in the year 2000. Neil, if you think about this as a 3-act play, where are we in that 3-act play?
I feel like the curtain just came up on Act 1 in a lot of ways. We're pretty sure it's going to be a good play, and we're excited to see it, but there's still a lot to explore and find out. And so as I'm thinking about this, what I'm trying to set companies up to do is iterate really quickly and get maximum learning and maintain a lot of flexibility. And so there are a couple of things that are pretty front and center right now. So the rate of change in all of these models is just amazing, and I think it's going to accelerate. And so I'm trying to avoid getting locked into any particular solution. If I'm building directly to an LLM, I want to be able to easily do that to GPT and Llama and Bard. And so, we're thinking about creating basically abstraction layers between the LLMs. The other thing that's incredibly important, and this has been touched on a bunch today, is, having your data ready to go and ready to integrate is super important. And so all the good stuff that we've done with data management and labeling and all of that just gets more important, and having the tools to effectively manage that. And then, prompt engineering and management is kind of a subset of the data problem in some ways. Your data plus your prompts get you to where you want to be, and so you need to be able to manage those well. And then human in the loop is, I think, critical at this point. So how do you create systems that allow the experts or the people that are interacting directly with the customers to sort of tweak and get those changes back into the data and into the prompts. So those are kind of the 4 big pieces we're looking at pretty broadly across the set of applications that we're taking a look at now. So.
Fiona, I'm sure many in the audience are trying to figure out, do I build, do I partner? How do you think about that, and how would you advise them?
Yeah, it's a hard one. It's not a one-size-fits-all. I think you really need to look at your use case. So, for example, I think with the customer service assistant use case, for the most part, we are building on top of something that's already there, where I think we can leverage an LLM. And as the LLMs get better, I like the point you made around an abstraction layer, because I may not care which one I use if it's easy enough for me to move. And that would be one where I would just say, hey, look, go ahead and leverage something that's out there. There are some where it may behoove you to kind of actually build out your own sort of foundational models, right? And so in Wayfair's case, we're more, I would say, multimodal, right? So there's definitely a lot that's in text, but we also deal a lot with imagery. So for that kind of data, and we have built up a lot of proprietary data just from all the suppliers that have sent us pictures, and then the text that goes with it. So we actually, for that particular use case, we're building, we feel like we're building out, it makes more sense for us to build out a foundational model that's based on our own data, and we're partnering up with one of the AI startups to do that. And so I think once we have that foundational model, I think it can power the existing use cases that we already have, plus potentially new use cases in that particular space. So I think it almost looks, you kind of think about where the quickest time or the easiest way is to just leverage what is already out there, versus there's something very unique about either the modal, for us, the multimodal particular parts of that, plus the kind of data, proprietary data that we have.
What I'm hearing is, in my next career, I'm going to be a product manager defining use cases. Am I connecting the dots well here? Elizabeth, why don't you talk some about what you're seeing in marketing from a Gen AI perspective? What applications or use cases are you seeing in marketing that you think or that you're really excited about, that maybe you couldn't do at Stitch Fix a year or 2 years ago, that could be done today looking forward?
I think some of this got touched on earlier, but I do think a lot of the content creation oftentimes is a long pole in the tent of actually creating that and finding things that will resonate, or even testing it. And the pace with which that can be done is just so much higher. I remember within the Stitch Fix environment, like the copywriting, the email writing. I think in the last panel there was touching on things like, barbecue themed outfits or whatever. Like actually generating that so much more rapidly, I think is quite powerful, and putting more of maybe the higher order like concept in the hands of the marketer, but the actual execution of it, so many elements of that can be done so much more rapidly. And I do think it poses a question of like, how do you train junior folks who are moving up the ladder of marketing? Because oftentimes those are like the entry level jobs. So I do think that's a question of how do you equip teams, like what is the role then of the marketing team writ large? But I think a lot of that content, copywriting, even imagery, there's so much that's possible so much more rapidly, when a lot of those things might take multiple weeks to get a campaign or some new idea that's hot in the market that you want to take advantage of, like these something that happens to that comment earlier too on Twitter or X now, like how do you take advantage of that? Might have been hard to capture as quickly, but now can move so quickly. And so just equipping teams to be able to do that much more rapidly. I think to me that's one of the most exciting shifts is being able to do that. Like we had photo studios that would take days or even weeks to get stuff produced, but now being able to do that so much more rapidly. So I think that's one of the most exciting shifts, and then being able to weave that through the entire experience.
Great example.
Yeah, just to pick up on that a little bit, so multivariate testing has been just the game changer in digital commerce, right? And LLMs and AI, to your point, just make that flywheel go much faster. And I'm really excited about being able to take all of the data that you collect, feed it back into the next generation of prompts, and just see how quickly you can hone in on the optimal outcome. So.
Thank you. Fiona, what keeps you up at night related to Gen AI, and specifically around e-commerce or retail?
I think a lot of it is around, actually I sleep very well, I don't really stay up at night too much. But I think certainly the part around like, what is this going to cause a pivotal shift in terms of how consumers search and seek, and how do we make sure that we're a big part of that equation, right? And it could be whether it's doing it well enough that, in terms of anytime anyone wants to buy something on home, that they come straight to Wayfair, and that we have an experience that's really differentiated, right? And so how do we leverage Gen AI to be able to make sure that we're good? But then also, if people are searching still on Google, and it's going to be more of an assisted mode where you see that, hey, instead of before when you search and you get 20 search results and you mull it over and figure it out, if it's going to be much more of an assistant where it comes up with, and here's a couch you should buy, then I want to be that couch, right? I want to make sure that my couch is that couch. So trying to make sure that we understand and leveraging it well enough so that we can kind of play in this potentially brand new world, I think is something that I'm certainly thinking a lot about.
Okay, this is our last question. This flew by. What are your predictions for the next 6 to 12 months? What are you most excited about? What do you see coming?
Well, one thing I was going to say, I found it really exciting seeing the new Bloomreach demo, and I do feel like that is the future of e-commerce in the sense of it feeling like truly interactive and personal. And so much of e-commerce has been search-based shopping. It's essentially people putting their entire product catalog online, and then it is the job of the customer to find what they want. And that was a lot of what got me excited about taking the role I have for the last 3 years. It's really hard to shift that paradigm. And I think a lot of that is because the technology hasn't been built that way. There's a lot that stands in the way from making like a browse-based personal experience at scale. Like that is just very, very hard to do. And so I think all of these examples where whether it is truly chat-based and completely machine learning-based or human-based, doing that at scale through Gen AI and combining that human in the loop, I think is really exciting. And so I just feel like that's a way better way to shop. Now, does that mean e-commerce will go from 20 to 80%? Maybe not. Like we all still enjoy going into stores. Like stores play a role in our lives. But those use cases where you felt like it was so much work and you had to put more onus on yourself to do all the research, like to me, I think that is going to evolve rapidly. I think we massively overestimate the 12 months and underestimate the 5 to 10 years. I think that's like a Bill Gates or somebody's quote. So it's probably not in the next year, but in the next 2 to 3, I think it is going to be very different than it is today.
Thank you. Neil, anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think we're really going to see an acceleration in the ability to create content and to have smaller teams have bigger impact. So I see AI as being sort of power tools for intellectuals, right? It helps you kind of get to the result faster. And so there are a bunch of domains in marketing and in sales where I think you're just going to be able to move a lot faster, get better data, and iterate a lot faster. And I think those are going to be the really early impacts. Yeah, so I'm excited to see how that plays out.
And Fiona, anything specific you can share in Wayfair that you're doing in the next 12 months?
A lot of it's sort of like deploying and scaling out the human in the loop test cases that we already have, right? So I think that's the part that we can accelerate, and it'd be great to see how those work in production at scale. The other one I'm really excited about is also using some of the code generation capabilities to go solve some of our biggest tech debt problems. Because I think at the end of the day, GenAI is all great, but you still need a proper system that is scalable and flexible, and you got good architectural practices and good software coding and all that. So we're also looking at how we can help sort of get some of the tech debt that we have fixed up. And then I think the last part probably is just the experience parts of it, right? And I mentioned there are different things that we're experimenting with, and just seeing if we can figure out how to get ahead of how might the consumer shopping experience change, and specifically for our particular category, right? What might that be, and how can GenAI help, and how do we experiment with that? So I think we're kind of approaching it in those ways.
Thank you. Fiona, Neil, Elizabeth, please join me in thanking the three experts in sharing their experiences.